Good morning to everyone who has joined us so far. We're just going to wait a short while, just to allow others to join the session before we begin. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, it looks like our numbers are levelling out, so we will make a start this morning. I'd like to warmly welcome all of you who are joining us this morning. My name is Kiri Fotu. I'm the Information Advocacy and Support Manager here at Muscular Dystrophy UK, and I'm delighted to be chairing our final practical Muscles Matter seminar on housing and housing adaptations. So since 2020, the MDUK Muscles Matter online seminars have become a regular feature in MDUK's virtual events calendar. They will not replace our live events going forward, but will continue to run alongside these when we can host them again. Just as a reminder that our helpline remains available to anyone affected by a muscle wasting condition. Please do contact us if you have any questions or need any support. We can help you with information and can either support you directly or point you to a place where you can get support. The number and email address of our helpline team you should see on your screen now, but you can call us on 0800 652 6352 or email our team on info@musculardystrophyuk.org. This morning, we are focusing on housing and housing adaptations. We know how important it is for children, young people and adults who are living with a muscle wasting condition or a neuromuscular condition to find or to live in suitable housing to meet their needs. It's a key part of independence, overall well-being and quality of life. But we also know how challenging and complex it can be to find the right sort of home or to access the adaptations that you need to support you to live well. We are very grateful to be joined by a fantastic panel this morning, covering a broad range of expertise and knowledge relating to housing and housing adaptations. They'll share information and advice on what they've learned from their own personal and professional experiences. We're also very grateful for the support of our Muscles Matter sponsors. Before we begin, a note on how you can ask questions or make comments throughout the session. We have some advanced questions and we will seek to cover these later on, but we'd also like to incorporate some live input, and to do this, we'll be using the Q&A function. Please type your question or comments, which we will feed them into the discussion later. To help us manage the technical side of the event, we won't be calling on attendees to ask their questions directly, and any questions we don't manage to cover or don't know the answers to, we'll seek to answer through our website afterwards. And finally, a reminder that we are recording this session and it will be made available online over the next few days, so do keep an eye out for that. So to start off this morning, I'm really delighted to introduce to you our panel. Once I've introduced them, I'll invite each of them to share with us some experiences and support that they provide before moving into questions and discussion. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Colin Jones. Colin is the Children's, Young People and Families Occupational Therapy Head of Service at Birmingham City Council. He has been in his current role since 2008 as the lead Children's Occupational Therapist for Children's Services. Within this role, Colin works closely with children, young people and their families, including other council services and agencies, to provide support and interventions relevant to their needs. Colin has worked as an occupational therapist for over 20 years and has been involved with the Royal College of Occupational Therapists for the last 2 decades at various levels, both regionally and nationally, including Vice Chair of the College's Council. We are also delighted to be joined by Bia Moon. Bia is a senior occupational therapist who has worked in both adult and children's local authority services, as well as in the private sector. Bia has previously worked as part of a specific occupational therapy lead disabled facilities grants team, which actioned and supported the build side of adapting people's homes within a large local authority. Bia is now working within a service that assesses, recommends, guides adaptations where appropriate within homes and in educational settings. And Bia's wish is for people's homes to be more usable and to reflect how people want to live their lives regardless of need. We are also joined by my colleague, Jackie Monroe. Jackie is the Regional Information Advocacy Support Manager in Scotland and has worked for MDUK for nearly 5 years and comes from a social work background. Jackie uses her knowledge and experience to contribute towards achieving positive outcomes for people living with muscle wasting conditions. And finally, we're really delighted to be joined by Jerry McMenemy. Jerry is a Duchenne dad who had no experience of accessibility matters or living adaptations until his son Sorley was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy at the age of 3.5 in 2017. As a family, Jerry explains that the decision was made to be as proactive as possible when it came to making sure that all of the environments around Sorley, from school to home, were the best possible inclusive environments to support him with managing his DMD and to also growing up enjoying his independence. And 3 years on, following what Jerry describes as a crash course in project management, discovering funding, working with good occupational therapists, negotiating with local authorities and architects, and finding a good builder, major adaptations have been completed to their home. Jerry will be sharing what he has learned so that other families can access the support that they are entitled to. So, Colin, if I could come firstly to you, could I ask you to talk about the support that you provide to children, young people and their families, and a bit about the way that an OT or an occupational therapist can support individuals and families with muscle wasting conditions?
Very big subject for a very small amount of time you want me to speak on. Yeah, as an occupational therapist, I've been very proactive within supporting children with muscular dystrophy and their families, both Duchenne's and various other forms of muscular dystrophy. And to be honest with you, it's about finding the right solution at the right time for the family that's relevant to them. And I think that's key. And as an occupational therapist, we specialise in activity adjustment, environmental adjustment to make activities that are real and need to be done in the family work. And it's very much about supporting families through what is a very varied system across the country and helping them to engage at the right level at the right time, whilst also thinking about how people can achieve and access the things and do the things they want to do, and that their home isn't a barrier but actually enables them to do that.
Thanks, Colin, that's really insightful, thank you. And Bea, if I could come to you next, could I ask you a little bit more about what I mentioned earlier about your desire for people's homes to be more usable and reflective of how they want to live, and maybe what that might look like when an adult or a family is navigating the adaptations process?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a well-known fact that getting and navigating the adaptations kind of process in many, many spaces is quite difficult, quite arduous, and not quite what people expect. So for me, I always want spaces to be usable, I want it to be functional, and I want people to be able to use those spaces as they would in their normal kind of everyday lives. So to reflect how they want to live as people and how they want to use spaces within their homes and in the community and in educational settings. So I think sometimes we kind of get lost in the process of what professionals think rather than what people want as humans to be able to do within their homes and within their lives. So I think a culture shift is due on that situation.
Thanks, Bea. And Jackie, it would be great if I could come to you next and ask you to share a little bit about the work that you do at MDUK and maybe some of the common requests relating to housing and housing adaptations that we receive as a service, and perhaps what resources and support is available for people from MDUK.
Yep, no problem. So within the advocacy team, we support people to explore housing options and just to ensure their options are maximised. So this might involve kind of supporting them to go through housing applications, providing details of housing providers in the local area, and ensuring they're in the correct priority group or banding for allocation. We support people to challenge decisions which they disagree with. That might be in relation to the housing adaptations process or in relation to the Disabled Facilities Grant, also known as the DFG process. And we support people with communication to local authorities just to make sure that professionals involved have all the information that need to be making informed decisions, and just to make sure that the families are at the forefront of any decisions that are made as well. So in terms of kind of resources, we have our housing adaptations manual, which we can send out to people, and we just share that with professionals. And we really just support people from kind of the beginning of the adaptations process right through, just to make sure that or any decisions that are being made are kind of accurate and well informed.
Thanks, Jackie. That's some really key information about how MDUK is able to support people and their families. And finally, Jerry, if I could come to you, we heard a little bit earlier about your story And I know that your most used phrase throughout your adaptations process was that nothing is impossible, which is a really hugely powerful and positive phrase. Having completed major adaptation to your home now, and as you say, delivered that phrase, nothing is impossible, can I ask you to share with us your journey and your experience and let us know a little bit more about Sorley's adapted home environment now?
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity to be along today. And yeah, nothing's impossible. It doesn't seem it at the time, because even the smallest thing can try and trip you up, and you think it's put there to trip you up. But actually, we're a good team round about you, and that's your family, friends, and indeed Jackie as well, because I was on the phone with Jackie a few times. It's amazing what you can get. After Sorley's diagnosis, we, as you had said, we were very proactive. We said, let's get things, and it was about getting the right school for Sorley. Then the next thing was getting his environment that he lives in to be right, get the house done, and do it once. And that was the big thing for us, was that we wanted this done, we wanted it done right. And it wasn't a case of drip feeding bits and pieces in. It was going to be significant what his needs were. So our kind of design brief was to ourselves was, we do it once, it's future proofed forever, so that it never ever needs to get done. And it's done, it beats the progression of Sorley's condition. So the house is ready for Sorley, not that Sorley is ready for the house. And that was a really, really difficult concept to get across to some people. And do you know, the last thing that we put in was just not off a whim, but actually something that we're all entitled to. And you spoke about, you know, we've heard about functionality and design and whatnot. Do you know, adaptations can be pretty as well. You know, it's your house. You're entitled to decide how you want your house to look. And Sorley was entitled to see how his house looked, and that's what I'm sitting in at the moment. You can see this is Sorley's bedroom. This is the end result. He's at school, so I get to use his bedroom. Other than that, I don't get to. But that's what we set off. And our first blow that we got was eventually, when we got through the red tape, the social work and whatnot, was the local authority we had didn't at that point in time have a paediatric OT in post. So we got allocated an adult OT who came out, and we got a very nice handrail for an upstairs bedroom. And we were given a bath lift for an upstairs bath. And then the brakes were put on. We said we wanted to progress further so that the house was ready for Sorley. And I give them credit for the expertise that they will have in their own area, but they were not a paediatric OT. They presented to their senior managers, and the answer came back, sorry, your son's not disabled enough yet. Now, knowing that your son has got a life-limiting condition and what is in front of you, to be told that is actually incredibly insulting, and I don't think that anyone intended to insult, but that's what the manual said, that's what the funding said. So we pushed back against that. Our first step was to write to the head of social work and the chief executive saying, when are you going to employ a paediatric OT, or are you going to outsource this to some other local authority, or are you just going to give us the money so that we can get the OT advice? We actually got a really positive response back telling us that the business case was ready to go for a paediatric OT, and they have employed an outstanding individual who she's been fantastic with us, and she came on and understood exactly what we want, even down to it's got to look good as well because it's our house and it's Sorley's house. And it was a 2-year process after that, which I don't know whether it's fortunate or unfortunate that it was during the COVID period, you know, the lockdown period, but we actually had the time to be able to speak to people, pull it all together, so that when almost exactly a year ago when we started the build, everything was good to go. It was state of the art, it was designed, it's got assistive technology in it, it's hardwired for the future. There's no hoists in the house, but all the bits that we need to attach the hoist to are hidden behind walls. So we're there and we're ready for the future. And Sorley has been part of that design, part of the build, and knowing why the house is getting adapted to the way that he wants it to be, not the way that he finds has to be, because there's a barrier because you can't get from room 1 to room 2.
Thanks, Jerry, so much for sharing your experience so openly and honestly and in quite a lot of detail. And I'm sure that many families and individuals going through this process will hopefully take a great deal from your family's experience. And really important how to hear how Solly was involved, because as you say, this is for his environment. Thank you again to Colin, Bea, Jackie and Jerry for all of your comments and insights. And now that we've had the opportunity to hear from our panellists, we'll move into some questions, which we've had some come through in advance already. Just as a reminder, you can submit questions to our panellists through the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. So we've had one come through just as we've been chatting. It's a very general question. It's about being rehoused and maybe who can help someone be rehoused. So I wonder, Jackie, if I could come to you, if it's quite a general query, maybe we can give this individual some advice on perhaps rehousing possibilities or options for them.
Yep, of course. So I mean, I would usually advise people to get in contact with their local authority in the first instance to explore what their kind of local housing options are. In Scotland, we're quite fortunate to have a charity who support people with exploring all their housing options as well. So I would always recommend to kind of reach out to local organisations to find out what support's available. Because, you know, in terms of kind of sourcing housing, that can be quite challenging. So it's good to explore lots of different providers if it's social housing that you're looking at. But also things like the Citizens Advice Bureau can advise on kind of purchasing options and things like that as well. If someone's been on the housing list for a long time, we can generally kind of contact them and make sure that their housing application is accurate, that they have all the kind of up-to-date medical information and they're in the correct grouping. We can sometimes liaise with housing officers from the local area just to make sure that that person's in the forefront of their thoughts if any properties do become available as well. And you can also contact things like your local MP as well. You know, if you feel like you've been waiting a long time, it's good to find out what the wider options are in the area as well in terms of properties being built and things like that too. So that's my advice would be find out what local support's available. Definitely get in contact with our advocacy team as well, and we can kind of talk through options. I think doing research in the local area is really important about kind of different housing providers, what properties are becoming available and what your options are depending on your income and things like that as well.
Thanks, Jackie. And yeah, it can be quite an overwhelming system to navigate, can't it? So just knowing who you can go to for support or where you can turn to for advice is really important. Thanks. And we've had a question, a pre-submitted question.
Can I just add to that if possible? As an occupational therapist, completely agree with everything Jackie said and frequently have that conversation with people in Birmingham around, you know, how to access. But I suppose the question for me is to take it a step back before that. Why do you need to rehouse? What is the purpose? Because that for me is a key element. If you're rehousing because your current property isn't meeting the needs of your young person or yourself or your family, if that's the reason, it might be that actually it can be adapted to meet that solution, because quite often certain properties become gold dust within authorities, especially within Birmingham. Certain numbers of bedroom properties, if it's to do with overcrowding, they're just gold dust, they just don't come up. And so actually sometimes the rehousing route is actually a little bit of a red herring, because people go down that route to try and rehouse to get the right number of bedrooms, when actually it's not going to happen unless you're looking wider than sometimes those authorities. So sometimes I think the advice about knowing your area and your options is really important. But if you take it back a step and go, why are we rehousing? What's the reason for the rehouse? Do we want to rehouse? Because quite often rehousing takes you away from the community you're already plugged into. So that's something that needs to be considered as well. Oh, I can see there's some more information going on there as well. But I would just say, think about the purpose, and that's where having a conversation with an occupational therapist in the local authority about adaptations, if it is to do with additions, that, as Jerry said, is a paediatric specialist, because that specialist knowledge makes a huge difference. And if they don't have that specialist knowledge, there are loads of occupational therapists across the country, like myself and Bea, that are available for our colleagues, that they can contact us anyway and have a conversation. Within Birmingham, we have a lot of muscular dystrophy, and we have lots of children with Duchenne's, and we have females with Duchenne's, which as well is very rare. So we have a massive wealth of experience of doing these adaptations. And sometimes, as Jerry said, it's the little things that make a huge difference. And it's also recognizing and understanding that. So I'd say take it a step back, know why you're rehousing, and is what you're wanting actually achievable in the time scale that you have, and is the payoff worth it? And I completely agree with Jerry, nothing is impossible. It just depends on whether it fits for you and your family in the time scale you have, because quality of life is the most important thing for our children that deal with this condition and the families.
Thanks, Colin. And Jackie, you had another comment, is that right?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say I completely agree with Colin, actually, and something that I never mentioned is quite often people look to be rehoused because they've been advised that their existing property can't be adapted. And I know Jerry had mentioned earlier on about you know, the manual said so, and it's that whole kind of just not being very flexible about what can be done, what is achievable, you know, and just kind of thinking outside the box. Can the property be adapted, or is, you know, how much is that option being explored before it's been completely ruled out? Because obviously waiting for a house can take a long time as well. And actually, if the existing property can be adapted and all options are being explored in relation to that, then that's sometimes a much better option than being rehoused or trying to wait for a house and it's not becoming available as well.
Thanks, Jackie. That's a really important note. And we've had a question about general advice for families going through the adaptations process. Jerry, could I come to you on that one? Is there anything any words of wisdom perhaps that might be really key?
Yeah, know what you're entitled to. Find out what you're entitled to. A lot of discussions and meetings. You as the client, as the parent, will be more informed than some of the professionals that you deal with, from whether it be a housing department or you know your own child better. And you'll also probably have read their policy on adaptations and grants in more detail than that individual has, because you're the one that's got the vested interest in it. So know the detail. What we did was in Scotland, the legal standing on the document is a coordinated support plan. I can't, someone would need to assist me with what it is in the other you know, countries, England, Northern Ireland. But the coordinated support plan is very focused on education, and it's a legal document that says, no, you need to get this right, and if it's written into this document, you need to provide it. What we wrote into that document right at the very beginning of it with the local authority was that all of Sorley's environments, plural, would be conducive to effective learning and inclusivity. And at the time, it was always assumed that we were talking about the school. Actually, he was fatiguing so much at school that the only way to balance that out was to make sure that his home environment was right as well. And we actually had that in a legal document that this local authority had signed up saying, yes, we will make sure that his environments are conducive to effective learning. So we actually had a bit of legal muscle behind that as well. And to have taken a local authority, and we didn't have to go down this route, but to have taken the local authority to a tribunal to challenge their commitment to that would have been pretty poor PR for them, and something that at all costs they would want to avoid. So we had that kind of legal standing. The other Scotland-wide is the scheme of assistance, which is what tells you what the local authority will contribute to in relation to adaptations, etc. And it's worth reading that in absolute fine print, because the officers that we spoke to, the grants officers, were speaking about an 80% grant. But in actual fact, there was a one-liner in our local authorities that said, well, if it's a child under 16, it's 100%, right? And it's about trying, finding that, because not all of these professionals, I mean, they may be dealing with, I don't know, thousands of these grants per annum, how many of them relate to the specific needs that we're going to them with. So know your facts and be prepared to challenge. You can only say no, and you say, no, I want you to go and check that. And after they come back and tell you 3 times, no, we have checked it and it's definitely right, then that's the time where I'll maybe back off on the negotiating side of things. So don't give up, know your stuff, and be confident that you do know your stuff. The worst you can get is a knockback at the end of the day, but we'll go through a lot of these before we actually accept one.
Thanks, Jerry, for that. That's really important to know for lots of people. I'll come to another question, which is actually related to funding for DFGs. So it's, my child has a muscle wasting condition and we applied for a DFG to make adaptations to our home. The council have awarded us with £30,000, but the cost of these works goes beyond this figure. We've been told that we need to fund this ourselves, which we really can't afford. I read online that some councils might be able to provide additional funding on a discretionary basis, but I don't know how this works or how I should go about asking for this. I guess this might be something for perhaps Jerry, Bea and Colin to come into, if that's okay. Yeah, it would be great to get all your thoughts on this question.
Shall I go?
I was going to say, Bea, you can definitely answer that one. Go for it.
Yeah, so it is correct. Some local authorities or spaces do have additional discretionary funds. And I would encourage that family to really pursue what the parameters of that are, because I know that some local authorities do not have that written in principle. So there is a degree of argument to be had there, because if they don't have it in their policy and they don't have it written anywhere, technically there's room for manoeuvre really with it. So I would encourage you to kind of ask the questions of them, ask why, and then my kind of stance on it is also the need has been identified and the need cannot be met with the amount of funding that you've been provided. So you could argue that that's not a feasible solution and it's not going to meet the needs of your family or your child. So I would kind of pursue that element from that kind of funding side. Because if it doesn't meet need, then it's kind of a bit of a difficult situation. It's not resolving anything. It's not improving quality of life. It's not improving access. Colin?
I know this sounds like, and is the exact opposite advice of what Jerry's given about his family example of doing it once, doing it right. And actually, where possible, that is the gold standard. And that's always the option we want to go with. However, sometimes you need to be savvy with the resource available. And also, if you have got a deterioratory condition, none of us can say with absolute clarity when you're going to need certain of those adaptations. And a sequential approach actually means you have better access to resources. It's knowing when and where, and it's understanding your child. And I think Jerry's dead right. You are the expert of your child, without doubt. So utilize that knowledge. If you know that child's condition and your child's condition is deteriorating really fast around access, and that's your big concern, then maybe address the access issue first, and then deal with the other issues later on. There's a little known fact, and lots of colleagues will not be happy about me sharing this, but it's the law and it's available, which is that actually, well, each financial year you can apply for a new DFG or disabled facility grant dependent on the needs as identified and assessed by the local authority, by the occupational therapist traditionally. And again, if they don't understand the condition, it's a deteriorating condition, that will impact. But it's also knowing the purpose. Why do you need that provision at that point in time? And actually, it's future-proofing, yes, but also knowing you don't have to have it all at once necessarily. And actually, if you can maintain a function for as long as possible, then you get a much better long-term management option available. And also, it empowers the young person to have control over the little control they do have. So it's about finding that balance point. And the difficulty is that it's very hard to generalize in this scenario because it should always be tailored to the person and the family. And so we can give you general hints and advice, you know, but it's about what works for you. And sometimes it is about having that open and honest conversation about what's most important for you right now. And if somebody said, no, you can't have that, and it's over £30,000, my response would be, so what are you offering to meet the need? Because it is a legal obligation to the authority. And sometimes you just have to ask the questions, because then heads of service will go, well, actually, there is no other alternative. And actually, it's cheaper. And we're only talking £5,000 difference here. Well, actually, if we looked at a separate provision of a ceiling track hoist through a piece of equipment rather than through an adaptation, or we look at something differently, we would be able to facilitate that. So it's about understanding why it's a no, what elements are no, and what options are they offering then. And that then takes the discussion into a space that then the family can talk about tailored, can talk about appropriate solutions. And then if the authority is choosing not to engage, some authorities don't, there's also understanding that a lot of authorities now have what they call a preferred solution. So you can say, actually, what is it that you are offering? Right, if I go down my own route, as long as I provide to the need, then actually I can get the provision I want, and I can top that up a little bit myself, and then actually I'll get the provision that will work for me. So it's knowing that it's not, a no doesn't necessarily mean no, it just means you might need to have a different discussion.
Thanks, Colin. And Bea, you had something.
I was just going to say as well, I completely agree with what Colin's just said, but also it's worth asking the question, are you providing that £30,000 for this specific recommendation, or the entirety of my recommendations made by the clinical professional that has assessed and supported my child with identifying this need? Because some local authorities go with the philosophy of this is for all of your recommendations, and some local authorities go with the position of this is for an individual recommendation. So it's worth asking the question, because the DFG legislation is a little bit foggy. So asking the questions can usually stimulate getting more what you need from them. So I just encourage, ask all the questions that you need to. Thank you.
Thanks, Bea. And Jerry, I know what we highlighted earlier, you said that part of your journey was discovering funding. Is that right? Is there anything you have on this question about asking for more money or knowing what's available to you?
Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Just ask, and have a look at unions. Your employer. Most lines of employment will have a benevolent fund or something, and they're usually not huge amounts of money, but it might be that for that final decoration or whatnot. And it's also a bit of bargaining power as well. To go back to the local authority, we were absolutely upfront when we got our builder, our architect, and the grants officer on site, and we said, right, we've got £5,000. That's what we've got. We don't have any more, we don't have any less. That's the money that we've got. So whatever happens through this build, we can't stretch beyond that. And we were brutally honest with them, and we stuck to that. And as we went along, and there was maybe something cropped up, maybe a bit of snagging or something like that, we pulled a site meeting in with all the professionals, and the builder said, no, we need to do it this way. The OT said, no, you're absolutely correct, that if we want to provide this the way that they have specified it, it's going to cost more. And I put my hands up and said, well, I'm sorry, I don't have the money. And we all look at the adaptations officer who goes away, and we did actually manage to creep up our grant after each one of these meetings. And it's maybe a bit of risk management going through it, but actually, if we hadn't done that, they're not going to leave us with a property that's unfinished and uninhabitable.
Thanks, Jerry, that's great.
One extra thing I think is worth saying as well, if you own the property, there's a very different discussion to be had if you're renting the property. And if you're renting the property, is it through the local authority, through social housing, or is it through a housing association or private? You still have access to a DFG, but it's knowing that different authorities manage that process slightly differently, and it's knowing that individual nuance. But also, if you own the property, it's also having in the back of your mind, once that adaptation's happened, because all of us are getting older, all of us are having more and more disabilities of different things, future proofing is becoming a really big issue within the housing sector across the board. And actually, it's the added value that you get sometimes to the property. I would argue a well-put adaptation will help anybody and everybody into older adulthood, as well as those dealing with childhood conditions as well. And the family members that are caring for those children sometimes will need that revision in the future themselves. And if it's done well and done properly, it will only add value to a property. So sometimes it's also looking at the bigger picture and knowing that actually right now, yes, I don't want to put myself in more debt. Yes, I don't want to, you know, get a provision that's not going to work. But actually, could this work for the long term as well? And is it going to add value? And actually that gives you a different conversation and a different level of, well, actually I can be flexible here. No, I can't be flexible there. And so it really helps you to be able to tailor a solution that works for you and your family and your future. So that's the purpose of the DFG, is there to help everybody that has a disability. And remember, there might be more than one person with a disability within that property, within that building. Every time that happens, you can argue very clearly, well, we have more than one person with that disability, therefore your upper limit of 30,000 doesn't apply. So, and also, just because it says it's an upper limit doesn't mean that it has to be. So be willing to have that conversation, I think.
Thanks, Colin. And I think it's a query we receive a lot, isn't it, Jackie, about we've been told this is the limit, and not knowing what to do then and feeling a little bit in despair, I guess. So hopefully this gives families, individuals, the confidence to go back and say, actually, no, this is what I know now. We'll move on to another question that's come through live. It's about whether it's reasonable for, I guess, the teams involved in adaptations to request seeing the child as part of maybe when they're surveying for any proposed works. I think the query was relating to, you know, coming out of school, so needing time off of school. Is there anything that we can hear from Colin, Bea, even Jerry, perhaps, on this?
I'll jump straight in. Yes, it is. It actually, I would argue, imperative, because if this provision is for this child, I think they should have some awareness and of what's going on and some say into it, because actually if it's going to be their environment that they're going to live in, and potentially, depending on their life expectancy and the progression of their condition, be something that is going to be their end of life space. Actually, quite frankly, if they're not in it, who's better to make that decision and that view to be heard than being there? And people forget, if it was a health appointment, nobody would question whether you need to have a child there. But when it comes to housing and adaptations, we sometimes forget the very person that it should be about. So yes, parents are fabulous because they know the child, but actually there is something really valuable, because I've been in loads of adaptations where when we get to the point of where we're having a survey done or a question or whatever else, and the child has then said, but actually I'm not bothered by that, but what I'm bothered by is that. And they may never have voiced it to the parent because it had never come into their mindset, because they'd never visualized or seen it. And it's not until you realize that and you go, well, actually, for that child, they don't want to be in the hoist for longer than they need to be. So actually having two separate singing track hoists that actually they can then have some dignity in between is more important to them than actually having, I don't know, a different access point or whatever else. And so it's about understanding their view. So if they're not involved in it, if they're not, you know, up front and center, then I would say you could so easily do this amazing adaptation that looks beautiful and everyone thinks it's fabulous. And the child is sat there going, I hate it. And it's going to be their lived environment. And that's not good. So I would say make sure that, yeah, we've been there. That's why we're saying don't do it. Make sure they're there. And schools and education should never have an issue with them being present, because actually we're talking a couple of hours over a school space. Actually, you wouldn't question going to see a GP or a doctor, and yet actually, why would you not have a child there when this is actually a space they're going to spend the majority and a big chunk of their lifespan in? So no, definitely have them there.
Yeah, I completely agree as well. So I think alongside what Colin's saying about what the child wants, it's also about the child's understanding of what's happening, because one of the biggest things that you can do is change your environment, and it's a lot to go through, and they've got to live through that process, and they've got to understand why things are taking a bit of time, or how things are going to look, to help them conceptualize what's going to happen. So I think part of that preparedness is really important as well. But I think also from a functional sense, it's really important to kind of know where things are going to be placed, where heights are going to be, how tall is that child, and if that child's likely to gain a lot of height, where are things reasonably needing to happen. So it's kind of about that, but how the child uses the space as well. It's how anybody would use the space. They're also incredibly important to that overall outcome. So I think they're, builders don't kind of know these things, and I always say to people that builders don't think but like therapists. So it's down to your therapist, but you mostly being the kind of person that's stimulating what's happening. And I think that's very daunting for some people. So whoever's involved in your support or your care, it's completely okay to ask them to come along, because I've been to lots of them where children or parents or whoever have just wanted me to be present, not even to say anything, just to be present for that process, because it's so big and it's such a big life event, I think, because it's one of those things, like Colin says, it's going to be there for the kind of dark days as well as the good days. So you want it to be reflective, you want it to be for you. That's kind of my take.
Thanks, Bea. And Jerry, did you want to come in there as well?
Just absolutely agree with both Bea and Colin that they're got to be involved, and they'll enjoy being involved. And there's some positive spin-offs from it as well. Solly's mental health has probably benefited from the fact that he's been involved in the design. And he believes in the construction, because he did have a paintbrush in his hand at some point in time. He, particularly, and all children are charmers, right? He charmed the builder, he charmed the architect, he charmed the people that hold the purse strings. We're not shy, right? It's very difficult to say no to a child. It's easy to say no to mum and dad. It's difficult to say no to a child. So he was part of our negotiations as well, and he was there. He even did his own build alongside when the builders were on site. He built a Lego model of what was going in, and he even did Lego figures of each of the builders and whatnot. And they loved him. And we had no snags at the end of that.
Oh, brilliant, Jerry, thanks. And I think just goes to show how important it is to keep them involved in the process. So
sorry, can I just add one other very important spin-off that we got? Was we involved the school as well, and the school and his teachers knew what was ongoing, and we got to the stage where he's got the wash and dry toilet installed in the house. The identical model to that is installed in a bathroom for him in his school at the same time as well, and that was done as part of the school did their adaptations at the same time as we did them. So yeah, it's really good having the school and the young person tied up with the family and what's going on.
Thanks, Jerry. I think that just highlights the importance of adaptations in a school as well. So really important to note. And we've had a couple more questions come through. We've had one relating to when adaptations are not possible. The question is, what can we do to highlight the need in the community for more fully accessible new builds for adults and children?
I can definitely say that every local authority has a housing department and has a planning and a regeneration and an approach around how they're utilising and developing properties. There is a lot of national agenda work going on anyway around accessible homes, and there is the lifetime home standard for any new build, which actually designs in there a lot of things that make a big difference. Now, it's not saying it's perfect, because it's not, because it's about trying to develop for 80% of the population. And that always means there's going to be some tweaking that's always needed. And sometimes even with the tweaking, it's not always going to work. So it's about finding that right balance. But it's about, I suppose, having that open conversation with people about, well, actually, in my area, did you know there actually are no, new builds with, whatever, a new development that's just happened down the road. Does it have accessible lifetime home standards? Does it have, a number of properties that are pre-adapted, are ready to go off the shelf for somebody that is a wheelchair user? Things like that. And actually, that has a real impact. And also, if you're thinking about purchasing a property or anything else in the future, go and have those conversations with those building companies and say, we're looking for, and also housing associations. We talk about all the time to housing associations, your best tenants will be those with disabilities, simply because they're consistent, they pay well, and they actually will leave your property normally in a better space than when you found it. So engage with those spaces and have those conversations, and know the power of asking. If people aren't asking, and then it gets forgotten about. So if you go and have a conversation with your counsellors, ask counsellors, sessions, open sessions, that's what they're for. What are you doing around your disability strategy? What are you doing around your accessibility of your homes? What are you doing around your therapy, your paediatric occupational therapist? How are you developing? How are you doing your sufficiency plan? How are you developing therapists? When was the last time you had a therapist that was nominated for an award, etc., etc.? Sometimes those conversations help to start that thinking process, because there are so many competing demands going on in local authorities. When they say they don't have the resources, they're not joking. They really are under a lot of pressure. And recently, people talked about, we're cut to the bone within the public sector. We've amputated in a few spaces. That's how bad it's got. It's just the reality we're all in. And it's not people trying to pull on heartstrings. It's just the way we are. But that doesn't change the reality that we have legal obligations that we take very seriously as officers, and we want to make a difference. So sometimes having somebody asking the people that manage those budgets, what are you doing around this space? Them then going and having a look and going, oh gosh, this is woefully inadequate. What are we going to do? We're going to hit grosses. That early conversation can start to make a sequential change. So go and ask your MPs, go and ask your councillors. That's what they're there for. They represent you. So, and if you have a child with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy or any disability condition, it's a reasonable question to ask, and it's a question that you should be able, your councillors and your MPs and your local authority officers should be able to answer. And if they can't, then they should be able to find out and go away and come back to you.
Thanks, Colin. That's answered that really well. Thank you so much. So we've got another question, and it's relating to when you don't find the paediatric OT or community paediatric OT is particularly helpful. The question is, what do you do, or who do you turn to for help and support in this situation? Can I come to you, Colin? Albeit, yeah.
It depends on why they're unhelpful. It's not always because they are being unhelpful. It's because sometimes we have preconceived perceptions of what we think will work, and the therapist is seeing maybe a different perspective, a different picture, and they're trying to find that middle ground. And it could be that they are so snowed under, they're not doing that very well. They might be having a really bad day, I don't know. Or it might be that there is a massive different perspective going on, to the point of where you have to say as a local authority, well, actually that's outside of our remit, or that's outside of our space. And that's not the therapist trying to say, go somewhere else. It's just that actually there's a different piece of legislation that covers that, or that doesn't come under the authority's duty or power. And it's not because they're trying to cheat you, they're not. It's just that they can't manage that element of it. And that's where, as Jerry mentioned before, there are other resources out there in the third sector. There's fantastic support from muscular dystrophy that can support that as well, asking those set of questions or giving that advice. So sometimes it's understanding why is it not quite working, but also I'd say counteracting that as well. As therapists, we are in a very pressured space, and Birmingham's no different from anywhere else. We have waiting lists thanks to C19. It was beneficial and a nightmare at the same time. But the reality is we are where we are, and actually we've got to manage the resources that we have. And so sometimes that means we have to say no to some people to say yes to others. And it is a balancing act. And sometimes we get it wrong. And it's about us having that open conversation and working that through. But when we get it right, we don't always get people coming back to us and saying, you did that really well, that really worked. Because what we tend to get is just the complaints of when it went wrong. And that's okay too. And there's a whole system around that. But having that you did well really helps when you're having those conversations, because also we're not mind readers. Sometimes we don't know if it went well or not, and we've done a huge piece of work, we've taken someone through the progress. We don't know whether it then went really well or not. We assume it did, unless we hear a problem. But that's a negative feedback system, and I would say, not only when it's going wrong, but also when it's going right, feed back to those therapists, feed back to the Royal College of OT, nominate for a merit award, say to the local authority, you've got a fantastic OT here, you need more of them. Please do that. But that's the reality that we're in. And I was described the other day as a hen's tooth, pediatric occupational therapist. I don't refer to myself as a pediatric occupational therapist. I refer to myself as an occupational therapist because that's what it says on my state license. But I'm an OT. But ultimately, I have specialised in paediatrics for quite a long time now. And the reality is I am an expert within my field. But, I'm an occupational therapist, but it's always nice to have feedback saying when you're heading in the right direction, because we're also trying to advocate for good quality practice. And sometimes it doesn't happen, and we need to be challenged on that when we haven't got it right. But I would challenge back, how often do you feedback when it's going right? And how do you do that? Because sometimes that doesn't always happen, and it's got to be a conversation, it's got to be a relationship, otherwise it never works effectively. I'll be quiet now.
Thanks, Colin. Jackie, did you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously in terms of if someone's kind of been unhelpful, there's formal channels that you can go through, but I also think as well, communication's key in a lot of situations, and I think a lot of the muscular dystrophy or conditions or neuromuscular conditions are so rare that quite often people have never came across them before as well, and it's actually getting people to understand more about the condition, and sometimes we involve the clinical team as well to pass on that information so that the person who's involved has got a full understanding of kind of progression or longer term. I think sometimes there's a real kind of focus on the here and now, and it's actually one of the difficulties trying to get people to forward plan, and I know Jerry had mentioned earlier on as well that response of where things were at there and then, in terms of what the manual said as well, and it's just trying to kind of get past that and keep the conversations going, and I think what Colin was saying there as well about saying to them, I don't feel that we're getting this right, how can we get it right, and how can we get on the same page as each other so that we can try and move it forward, and I would always be hopeful that the professional, the OT who's out would be responsive to that, that everybody's working towards the same outcome and the same kind of goal, so you was hoping that those kind of conversations can be ongoing, and sometimes it's good to involve a third party as well, sometimes just to help someone facilitate that communication between the local authority and the family or the individual or whoever it may be, whether that be a local advocacy project or if people get in contact with ourselves, sometimes just having a third person there as well, because it could be that outside perception is able to kind of just facilitate the communication so that everyone's got everything that they need to make good and informed decisions.
Thanks, Jackie. And Bea, did you want to add in there as well?
Yeah, I think I was pretty much going to say what Jackie said about communication. So a lot of the times where there has been a miscommunication, it always comes down to parties not understanding each other. So you have to make sure you feel like you and your occupational therapist or whoever is supporting you, because in some spaces you don't have an occupational therapist support you with this. I know some local authorities have housing representatives or other people like technical instructors that might get involved, whereas I do think you do need lots of advice from your OT on this one, because it's how you're going to use this space for your life. So your relationship's really, really, really important from the outset. So if you feel like you're not communicating well with each other and you're not getting on, that's a non-starter really, isn't it? But listening to each other, you have to make sure that you feel listened to as the person imparting this really valuable and quite sensitive information. And it's a really privileged position for us as occupational therapists to be part of your process. This is not you fitting into our jigsaw puzzle. We are there to support you, so you must feel supported. And if you don't feel that way, I'd firstly try and discuss this with that therapist, because no therapist, trust me, no therapist wants you to ever feel in any way like you are not part of that process or that you are uncomfortable. No therapist wants you to feel that way. But if that's not working for you, you can always ask for a change of therapist. You can ask for a second opinion. You can ask for it to be escalated in some way, because like I said, we're all there to support you. And that's kind of what we want.
Therapists always have difference of opinions. We all do.
I agree with disagree with Colin all the time.
We have conversations about that all the time, and that's fine. But some places are more open to conversation and that active learning than others are. But ultimately, if you don't feel that occupational therapist has heard you and your needs are not being met, or that there's a problem, you can go for a second opinion via other places. Now, the authority is not required legally to do that. But you can say, I disagree, and can I speak with the lead OT? I disagree with that view or that assessment. I'd like a repeat assessment. You're entitled to ask for that. And if they don't provide that to you, or you feel that you haven't been heard properly or assessed properly, you can challenge that through their complaint system. And if their complaint system doesn't work, you can challenge it through the ombudsman, or you can challenge legally if you feel strongly, or you feel that something hasn't been correctly processed. Other options are going independent and going and asking for an independent therapist to come and do an assessment. I would advocate a word of caution around what you ask, because if you ask, can it be done, the vast majority of therapists will always say yes. We fully agree with Jerry's view. The impossible is possible. It is doable. Is it the best solution? Will it meet your child's needs in the future? Probably not, but you didn't ask that question. And it's remembering, when you go into the independent sector or private therapy, then actually it's the question you ask is what they're answering. They won't necessarily be, is this the best solution, unless you ask for that particular view. And also, sometimes you're not asking just because it's the best view doesn't mean that it comes within that piece of legislation. And sometimes that's where the nuance will vary, and that area's policies or procedures. So you've got to be very careful when you're asking for a second opinion, what opinion you're asking for, because sometimes that can actually sully things a lot more and create more disruption and more issue for you than it actually solves. But the Royal College of OT has a space that you can connect in with. That's online. There are lots of independent occupational therapists out there. Just make sure that they're HCPC registered, and make sure that you've read some of the reviews, etc. Because just like any other space, there are some amazing therapists out there, and there are some that you maybe wouldn't be so keen to go and have a conversation with.
Thanks, Colin. That's really important to know. Jackie, did you have a final point to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add as well, I've worked with a lot of local authorities as well who are really keen to speak with other professionals who have that experience as well. And I think as an organisation, that might be something that we can support with as well. If a OT or another professional wants to connect with someone who has experience about what is possible, and how you can get down some of the kind of bureaucracy side of things as well, then it's worth reaching out and asking them, actually, do you want to speak to someone who has experience with working with a child with this condition as well, because that's that whole good practice, and I think it's good to know what other local authorities are doing and what is achievable as well. And it might just be that the local authority that you're working with doesn't isn't aware, they haven't done it before, and they just don't know what's possible.
Thanks, Jackie, for that. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of today's session, and I'd like to thank all of our panellists and the people who helped to guide the discussions with some really great questions and comments. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for sponsoring this event. Just as a reminder that you can see recordings of all of the other Muscles Matter seminars sessions on our website, and the recording of this session will be posted there later this week. We'll also be in touch with a very short survey to gather some feedback on the session, which will be invaluable as we shape how we run these sessions in the future. And just another note that our final Muscle Matter seminar of MDUK's 2021 series, which is a condition-specific seminar on CMD, so congenital muscular dystrophy, is taking place on Tuesday the 29th of March from 10 AM to 12 PM. Thank you very much again to our panellists. It's been great. And thank you everybody for joining us this morning, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye.